Let me say that some of the ideas I'm going to be talking about today were developed in a paper that a colleague of mine from the UK, Peter Nehrud, who was a senior police executive, is now at Cambridge University, that we wrote for the Harvard Executive Session in Policing called Police Science Toward a New Paradigm. You can find that on their website at the Harvard Kennedy School. Now, the first question is, why should the police be so concerned with becoming owners of science? Why now? What has to change? Well, it seems to me that police in Western society are faced with a growing set of crises. In most Western societies, including the UK, the police are confronted with steep financial cuts. It's much, much harder to get public funds. They're often criticized for being ineffective and for perceived mistreatment of the public. And governments, whether it's in Israel or in the US or in England or in Europe, are demanding that the police show that they're effective, that they're a good investment for the awful large amount of money they cost, that they're efficient, that they're getting it done at the lowest cost, and that they're legitimate, that they're doing all this while getting support of the people. Now, science helps us or can help us to find an answer to many of these problems. The reason is it provides a mechanism for how we can solve them. It can provide the underlying data and theory for identifying and developing programs which will be effective, efficient, and perceived as legitimate. It allows the police to test the effectiveness of their programs and their impacts on legitimacy so they can assess whether they meet those goals. Science can provide the new technologies. Today in this conference is a good deal of thinking about how new technologies can help policing, whether GPS, DNA, or a whole host of internet technologies. These can help us with police performance, and science can also help us not only to develop these technologies, but also to develop how we're going to use them with the police, and I'll talk about that a little bit today. Now finally, science can provide a method for showing, for the police demonstrating that they're succeeding. It's not enough any longer to just say we're doing well. You have to be able to demonstrate you're doing well. So science can help the police achieve all these goals. But in my view, in order for science to do that, the police are going to have to take ownership. So the ownership idea is very controversial. So I'm going to start today by telling you what I mean by ownership of science. I'm then going to turn to what happens when you ignore science, what some people have called the clinical experience model for innovation. I'm going to provide an illustration of what is often touted as a evidence-based policing model, hotspots policing. I'm also then going to turn and illustrate the pitfalls of evidence-based policing when the police fail to take ownership of science, why it's so essential that police become an important part, come to the table, if you like, in the problem of science. And then finally, I'm just going to say a little bit about a model of police ownership of science. Okay, so what do we mean by ownership? Now, by ownership, I don't mean that the police are the only owners. There are lots of owners of science, really. Academics have a great stake in science. They have ownership. Most of us recognize that. The government has a stake. They have ownership. They're often paying for science. The public have a stake in science, too. They want to know things. They want to understand what's going on. They want the government and the police to act in ways that advance their interest. In evidence-based policing, in our idea of science, the police should be a key player in science. And the truth is, they've mostly been on the sidelines up till now. So this represents an important change. What does ownership mean? Well, ownership means a commitment to the enterprise of science. And this is really important. A number of people, in reacting to this article we wrote, and there was a reaction at the Harvard Executive Session in the paper as well, they've said, do you mean that you're going to give the police ownership of science? That's like giving, putting the fox in the chicken hen. What's that going to do? Well, it's really wrong, because what we're talking about is the police become owners of science. You have a stake in it. It means you also become committed to science and its values. Those values include telling the truth, of using rigorous methods, of reporting things in terms both of what they can do and what the limitations are. Now, it's interesting to me, because what about scientists? Scientists have owned this for the most part, have had the biggest stake, if you like. Well, they also have interests. Getting published in journals, there's a publication bias. It's often the case that if you have positive results, you're more likely to get published in a good journal. So scientists also have a sort of a pressure, if you like, the fox and the chicken coop, a pressure to find positive results. For their careers, those positive results mean a lot in terms of advancing, promotions, and pay. But we don't object to that. We want the scientists to have a commitment to the values of science. We expect them to tell the truth. We expect them to use rigorous methods. We expect them to know the limitations of what they do. Now, here are three key elements before I get started telling you a bit about what I mean by the evidence-based policing and also about a clinical experience model. There are three key elements in our idea of police ownership of science. The first is the police must value science and its potential contributions to policing. Valuing science means a group of things. That means they'll value the norms and procedures of science. In other words, those become very important. It also means, by the way, that there'll be a commitment. The police will be funders of science. The police, this is really important. We ought to do something about it. Large technology companies put an important part of their budget to the problem of science and development, what we're going to do in the future. In policing, we need to do that as well. To do this, the police are going to have knowledge about the scientific enterprise. You shouldn't leave it to the scientists. You need to understand a bit about what they're doing to make sure they don't impose a republic on you, if you like, that you really don't understand. I was an advisor to the administrative office of the courts in New Jersey. They brought me in after a well-known scholar from the Midwest, the University of the Midwest, had given them a system for evaluating whether death penalty sentencing was fair. It was a statistical system. It was very complicated. Then they started implementing it. They used it in a case. And then they started getting criticized, and they came to me, and I found an appendix in the back of a report basically showing that the system was not very good at all for making decisions about policy. It was interesting statistically. It had the confidence intervals, if you know that, went from 0 to 100, meaning that the decisions they made could have been anywhere between should have been no or should have been yes. My point is that in that case, the Supreme Court didn't really pay attention to learning a little bit about the scientific enterprise and ended up, after having already issued an opinion, calling me at 2 o'clock in the morning, the chief judge, and saying, oh my God, what's going on here? So having knowledge about the scientific enterprise is important. And finally, the police must take a leadership role in science. Ownership requires involvement and activity. It means the police should be out there saying, this is what's important in police science. This is what we need to know. There are issues that today are not necessarily an important part of the way the police see their obligation. So why do I start off with why science is important? What happens when you ignore science? So quite often people talk about a clinical experience or craft model. This means that you identify what you're going to do, you identify innovations, and you develop and diffuse them primarily on the basis of clinical experience and opinions of practitioners. Now, as recently as 2012, a colleague of mine at George Mason, a distinguished police scholar, Steve Mostrovsky, said, the further diffusion of innovations among the vast majority of police organizations depends upon their becoming accepted as the right thing to do, entirely independent of the quantity and quality of empirical evidence, of their ability to accomplish desired goals. So in general, and I think that Steve is implying, although I think that's changing, that the clinical experience or craft model is dominant today in policing. In this model, science plays not much of a role. So let me give you an example of the dangers of this, and it's not from policing, it's from Scared Straight. I don't know if you've heard of this program. It's a program that uses meetings between prisoners and juveniles who are potential delinquents in order to get them to understand why it's a bad idea to become involved in a life of crime. It's a bad choice to become a criminal. Now, the program was very popular, actually. There was a reality television show, I don't know if you saw it, Beyond Scared Straight, which documented it in prison throughout the U.S. or in programs throughout the U.S. This program was diffused and it was developed, if you like, but it was brought to places throughout the U.S. based on the clinical experience model. People said, this is really good, it really works. I mean, and there's a good logic to it, right? I mean, you bring these tough-looking guys in their prison uniforms, etc., and they make these kids know what it's like to spend time in prison. It is scary. There are all kinds of rules there that are very unpleasant. You get yelled at. There are fights. Don't do this. Don't become involved in crime. And what does science say about Scared Straight? Well, Anthony Petrosino and his colleagues did a systematic review for the Campbell collaboration, published in 2004. And what that systematic review shows is not only that Scared Straight is not effective in reducing crime among young people, it's likely to cause harm. This is, by the way, a forest plot. This middle here, he said it would start, there it is. That's no effect. To the right here means favors control, meaning that the control group did better. You could see that on the bottom there, there's a diamond that says that there's a significant backfire effect here. The kids who participated in these programs, as compared to a randomized control group, actually did worse. Now you might say, is there a logic to why they did worse? Well, there's also a logic, which is, though we might think these guys look scary and whatever, a lot of these kids looked at them as kind of, look at how beefed up those guys were. They look pretty intense. Well, they came out of this with, I could be a tough guy, etc. Now, in any event, look what happened here. Clinical experience, there was a logic model. It said, this works, we're getting a good feeling, the kids look scared afterwards, and then we end up moving it from place to place, and scientific evidence doesn't seem to have an effect. Well, the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs at the time, Lloyd Robinson, now also at George Mason University, and Jeff Slowakowski, the acting administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice, they came out with an op-ed piece related to this program on television, saying the fact that Scared Straight programs is still being touted as effective despite stark evidence to the contrary is troubling. And during the administration of Lloyd Robinson and afterwards, these programs got no federal money. But it's not just they didn't get federal money. It's not just that the science said not only does this not work, it harms kids. It's also because practitioners I know, the police and others, they want to do good. They want to make the world a better place. Well, carrying out programs, diffusing them widely when they're in fact making things worse is not what practitioners really want to do. So what is the advantages of the science-based model, or the evidence-based policing model, as some people call it? It works on a process. And the process goes something like this generally. New practices and policies are based on theory and scientific evidence, statistics and basic research. It leads us to an idea of what types of programs we want to carry out. I put a little note here, what is the role of craft? I think many times people forget the role of craft. I'm going to tell you a little bit of why I think craft is important as well today. You then take that program, you field test it in multiple settings. Randomized trials are the gold standard for this in general, but there are other ways we can evaluate programs as well. I asked, should the police have a role in all that, or should the scientists come in and take the lead, or take a full ownership, if you like? If the practice or policy is found to work and to be cost effective, it's widely diffused. Not before then. You don't diffuse it across the country until you've seen that there's some evidence this is actually a reasonable program for us to use. Now, what's often used as an example of this is hotspots policing. I played a major role in developing it. Well, we began, not with this figure you see on your left here, whoops, but with data somewhat similar. This is from work I've dealt with done recently. It's on the law of crime concentration, I call it. If you look at large cities, you see that about the same number of streets produce a fairly large percentage of crime, no matter where you are, whether you're in Tel Aviv or Cincinnati or Sacramento. About 5% of the streets produce 50% of the crime. About 1% of the streets produce 25% of the crime. Well, if crime is so concentrated in cities, and Larry Sherman and I had data on this also when we developed our first experiment in the early 1990s, but if crime is concentrated in a city, why are you spreading police resources across the city? You ought to put those resources where they're needed, on hotspots of crime. As an FBI bulletin said later, if there are lots of fish in the sea, you don't just fish everywhere, you put the fishing boats where in fact the fish are concentrated, in the same way where crime is concentrated. Well, that basic idea developed from some theory and some basic research we had at the time led Larry and I to develop the Minneapolis Hotspots experiment. You can see here, it's we randomly allocated we randomly allocated 110 hotspots of crime, 55 to a treatment group, 55 to a control group. This is one of the first randomized field trials in policing. We then tracked what happened at those hotspots, which got a lot more police patrol. In other words, the police focused their efforts at the treatment hotspots. You could see up until, I'm not very good at this, I could say, up until the summer, there was a consistent difference in crime between the treatment hotspots and the control hotspots. The control hotspots had more crime, and in the summer that disappears. Well, what happened? In Minneapolis during the summer, it gets very warm. The kids are out making trouble, so to speak, and having fun as well, I should note. And the police go on vacation at the same time, at least during that period. So we couldn't achieve the dosage. So when the dosage on the hotspots we want to achieve, which is about 3 times the normal level of patrol, we ended up having no impact. But that was the first randomized field trial. It showed that you could, if the police concentrated in hotspots, they could have a deterrent impact. Since then, there have been 25 experimental and quasi-experimental studies. Again, a forest graph. The middle line is no effect. In this case, to the right of the line is you had a treatment effect, meaning that you had a deterrent effect on crime. The treatment groups did better than the control groups. All 10 randomized field trials showed significant positive effects. So you have a large bulk of evidence, or a large amount of evidence, that if you focus police on hotspots, you can reduce crime. And importantly, we also have evidence that you can do that without displacement to nearby areas. In this case, the middle is no effect. Towards the right is you had a diffusion effect. Ron Clark and I developed an idea we call diffusion of crime control benefits. In other words, not only do the areas around not get worse, which you would expect, right? If you push down the hotspots, won't crime just move around the corner? No, it doesn't happen, it turns out. If you have intelligent crime prevention programs, if you push down a crime at the hotspots, the areas around get better as well. And we have a series of studies here reviewed by Anthony Braga and his colleagues that show that. So we have, So we have a program developed on theory and statistics, basic research. We have experimental field trials and quasi-experimental field trials that uniformly say this has a positive effect. And then what we have, at least in the US, is wide adoption of this. Cody Telp and I produced this graph for an article, and if you can see, with cities of over 250,000 population, most of the departments are doing crime mapping, hotspots mapping, implying at least they're thinking about the idea of pushing the police to these hotspots of crime where a great deal of the crime in the city is concentrated. So that's a success story, right? I mean, it seems to follow the evidence-based policing model. But I was reminded recently that it also benefited greatly, this idea, from clinical experience. Indeed, right before Larry and I developed this experiment, I'd been doing an evaluation. I was finishing my doctorate at the Vera Institute of Justice in New York City. And what I did was, it was a community policing program, I should note. The cops each had about 15 square blocks, a sort of bad neighborhood, if you like. I spent 4 days a week walking around with the cops. It was made my career, so to speak. When I won the Stockholm Prize, I said, everything I needed to know about hotspots of crime, I learned in the 72nd Precinct in Brooklyn. But anyway, we walked around. I walked around with the cops, and after a few weeks in the field, it became apparent to me, there's a quote from an article I've just written for the Chicago Law Forum, it became apparent to me that the idea of bad neighborhoods belied the realities of crime in communities and how the police worked. We spent most of our time at a few bad places. Importantly, my observations of the positive impacts of police focus on those hotspots led me to doubt the common wisdom at the time the police could not prevent crime. Way back when, a long time ago, in the 1980s and early 1990s, before this experiment and others were done, or this program and others were developed, there was little evidence the police could be effective about crime. And here I was on the street with cops. They believed they could be effective. They had these 20 square block areas. They ended up focusing all their efforts on just 1 or 2 streets. So the idea of hotspots, if you like, and hotspots patrol really develops in part also from clinical experience. It didn't just happen in the laboratory, it happened in the street. Now, I observed that experience and I brought that experience to the research we did, but nonetheless, the clinical experience was really important. So I've already given you a little bit of sense of why it's important for the police to take ownership of police science. But let me just tell you a little bit about another study. I call it a cautionary tale. It's what happens when we don't, when we just leave the science to the academics. Okay, so, and it's my study, so I'm not criticizing anyone else here. What we tried to do is we wanted to utilize AVL technologies, automatic vehicle locator systems. At this conference, I'm sure people are very familiar with this, basically based on the GPS idea of your cars. So in this case, you could track the police wherever they are. Many departments, at least in the US, have AVL technologies, but they're not in all police cars, so it becomes difficult to talk about the entire patrol force. And in the US, often agreements with unions prevent their use for tracking police patrol. I understand in the UK, by the way, you're using this quite a bit for tracking where the police are. In the US, it was quite difficult. Dallas, Texas provided us with an opportunity to look how we could capitalize on this. They had every police vehicle equipped with AVL, or every patrol vehicle, by 2010. And the police managed to negotiate a contract with the unions, which allowed them to track where the police were, although it didn't allow us to name individual officers. That was the agreement. I don't know if police unions are an issue here in the UK. I've heard that the tracking is done here without much problem. Anyway, I came with the Police Foundation from Washington, D.C. To Dallas, and we said, we have a way you could use AVL that would enhance your directed patrols and get you greater crime prevention. It was based on a basic research idea. This is some data we developed. These are beats in Dallas divided into very high crime, medium crime, and low crime beats. This is the amount of unallocated police patrol time in Dallas over 11 weeks. It's about 60,000 hours of unallocated patrol time in a city in 11 weeks in Dallas, about 25% of the patrol time. By the way, unallocated is not lunch breaks, not going to court, not anything like that. It's time when you're on patrol and you're on call, but you're not doing anything specific. So we said, wow, there's an awful lot of patrol time here we could use. This is a great resource for crime prevention, and that was the motivation of the study. If we gave police commanders information about where the police were each week, would that allow them to better manage police patrol, get more directed patrol at hotspots of crime? And it was, we hypothesized if they could, they'd get a crime prevention impact. And they did on one level. This is a table. It shows that they got about 20% or 25% more unallocated patrol at the hotspots in Dallas during the 11 weeks of this program. Why 11 weeks? Because it was very hard to keep the department on an experimental protocol for much longer. This was something we thought would have immediate impacts. Total patrol hours also went up about 25% of the hotspots, and crime went down about 20%. And all these findings were statistically significant. So from the science perspective, we know if you use AVL as a management tool to keep track of where your police are, you can week by week manage your situation so you get more patrol, more directed patrol you wanted, and you'll also get a crime prevention impact. It's a randomized experiment, very strong results. However, and here's the problem, whoops, keep using the wrong. The project didn't have a large effect on crime. This is very important. From a science perspective, we saw we can get more police at hotspots, and we had a 20% deterrent at the hotspots, but we didn't get a general deterrence in the city, or at least in the beats that were experimental. And here's the answer, or here's the problem. If you look at the right side, the right here, this is the total crime in the treatment beats during the 11 weeks. Divided by the 4 types of beats. On the left-hand side of the screen is the deterrence of our program. We didn't have much deterrence. Why? Well, on the left side of your screen is the total number of unallocated patrol time, Dallas during that time, and the right side is how much of that was devoted towards hotspots policing? Hardly any. I can see Gloria Loicock, and she's telling me the mechanisms, David, the mechanisms. But anyway, I'll come to that in a minute. But in other words, what happened here was that they did use the program. The program worked to some degree. It increased the amount of hotspots policing, but it didn't take advantage of that 25% of free time of police patrol. So it only had marginal differences, if you like, and no effect on crime. So why was that? Well, we developed this study. The Dallas PD agreed to be the research site, but to be frank, they weren't very involved. In my view, they didn't take ownership. They didn't come to the table. We kept inviting them to the table. They said, well, what do we do? How should we carry this out? This was something that was owned by the Police Foundation, which carried out the study, George Mason University, myself, in developing the method of how to do it, and the National Institute of Justice, which supported the study. They were the owners. Now, what if the PD had the police department to come to the table as one of the owners of science? I think what would have happened is that their experience and knowledge would have played a key role in the development and the innovation. They would have said to us something like, well, what level of hotspots policing would we need to achieve jurisdictional benefits? We're not sure we actually do that much of it right now. What could we do to enhance it? How could we manage our police department in a way that would take advantage of this 25% of the crime? How could we have a service delivery system of hotspots policing? Now, I constructed a model, typical academic thing, you construct a model. What would have happened if we could have used more of that unallocated patrol time? So on the right of your screen is the total crime. Again, same, at least in the beats we examined. On the left side of your screen is if we took advantage of, if we got 25% of the time of this unallocated time and devoted to hotspots policing, if we could get them to do that, then we would have had about a 75% reduction of crime according to this model. It's based on all kinds of assumptions, but nonetheless, we would have had the kind of effect on crime totally we would have wanted. Now, what needs to be done? What does this say to me? What does this cautionary tale and what I've said so far tell us? And it seems to me that the key of it is that we need to have police as owners of science. They need to be really involved. The scientists may not think of things that are critical issues to the police. The scientists might find out about them afterwards. It's also the case that clinical experience in policing is really important. To develop an idea of evidence-based policing without recognizing the importance of what the police learn on an everyday basis is critical. And I should note, pointing to Gloria, that in her work on crime science, she's talked a lot about these sorts of issues. Now, let me say something about the present owners of science. I think that to some degree, the present owners of science have made a mess of things. I think we need the police. I think we need the police as owners. The government, it's inconsistent report. One government's there, they start pushing in one direction, you get a new government, they have a new set of priorities, they push in another. Political interference, not always, but many times political interference becomes a problem when ministers and others want to have a strong say in the directions. Questions are often asked that are distant from the needs of the police. Many of the people in Israel, the new minister of Internal Security, invited me to his office. He's in charge of the police to talk about policing, and after about 10 minutes I realized that he knew nothing at all about policing because it was a political appointment, if you like, but now he was about to run the office. And policing ultimately for government is just a small part of an overall set of problems. They have lots of other things to deal with. For scientists, the key issues in the everyday world of policing are not necessarily interesting. There's many scientists are not really interested in many of the key everyday problems of policing. And this seems to me a gigantic issue. In medicine, at the National Institutes of Health, they deal all the time with how you deliver the service, how other things are done. They're spending billions and billions of dollars a year on that. But a scientist in the world of police science, not all, are often uninterested in these issues. Indeed, look at scientists in policing that look at these issues as indeed not really getting at the core. They're sort of simply bureaucrats, if you like, getting at the not at the key issues of science. Scientists often have a shallow knowledge of everyday policing. So you invite scientists in to evaluate police programs and to develop them, and quite often They don't know much about policing. They never spent time in the police world. They weren't obligated in their training to do it. Now, I should note at Cambridge and UCL and other places, this is changing. These scientists are getting key understandings of the way the police world works. And I think just as important, I talked before about police valuing science. Scientists have to value the police craft. There's very important elements of the craft that we need to understand. That craft is important. In in medicine, randomized trials are key, but there are also journals about medical craft that tell the experiences of practitioners in the field. I mentioned earlier, what are the paths to police ownership of science? Well, the first is placing value in science. It's not just something to be done when it's convenient and get some extra money from the government. It's about advocating for science, about being out there saying we need science. We need it to do our job better. That's what valuing science is about. They need to become more knowledgeable about science. Scientific training should become a key part of police training. You can't just leave it to the scientists. Have you ever seen expert witnesses in court? You bring one here, one there. I mean, you need to have knowledge to be able to assess what's going on. You don't have to become the top technician, but you need to have basic knowledge of these ideas, of how science works. You can assess the science that's being offered to you. You need to take a leadership role in science. You need to become involved in scientific meetings. This, by the way, is an example of having science as part of your meeting, if you like. Journals, the new policing journal from Oxford. Science agencies. At the National Institutes of Health in the US, there are many practitioners who are involved in reviews, who are involved in boards, etc. That should happen in the science of policing as well, and it often doesn't. And what about the specifics of changing to a science-based police paradigm? I probably have trouble reading this. The first is education training. What has to change? Well, today, most education training in policing is based around legal knowledge and work-based training. Science has to become an important part about learning in policing. Linking scientific knowledge with practice and continued professional development. What do we know about what works? What do we know about what doesn't work? What do we know about cures that harm, about programs that backfire? Leadership. We need, as I already said, we need to see it not as, oh, science is something nice when it's convenient. Science is an essential part of what we do. In developing large internet companies, science is not just on the sidelines once you've developed what you've developed. It's a key part of keeping up to date, developing for the future. We have to change the academic-police relationship. Right now, they're separate. Academics and police and their training, etc., often don't ever come into contact with each other. Now, John Shepard, sitting in the front, he's developed an idea of combining a university setting where police and academics together learn together about science, etc., and about policing. And I think this is a really important experiment. The development of practice. Today, practice develops quite often by individual initiatives and political mandates. And don't get me wrong, I just wrote a memo for the Office of Justice Programs as part of a science advisory board there, in which I've said that many times practitioners will come up with really good ideas we ought to be paying attention to. That doesn't mean you implement them throughout the country. Maybe you want to test them in one place or another. But practitioners and agencies should be committed to a constant and systematic research and evaluation practices, right? This should become an important part of how police develop over time. And there should be an investment in research. Today, there's a limited national and local or individual commitment to evaluating specific initiatives. You have the College of Policing here, which I think is an advance in this regard. But there should be a committed percentage of police spending devoted to research, much as there is in other industries that are trying to advance and develop. And you already have it here to some extent with the police college, but I've advocated in the US for having a central body, research body, committed to the problem of policing. So, police ownership of science, in my view, we don't only do it because of a Machiavellian, they're going to put a republic on our situation. We do it because it's going to advance policing. It will allow the police to use science to solve everyday problems in policing. What I imagine is a world in which the everyday issues you deal with, we use science to figure them out, management issues and other issues. Will allow the police to respond to the crisis of legitimacy and effectiveness I noted earlier, where you can come up and say, look, what we're doing is effective, it's cost effective. What we're doing has a positive impact on the public. Those are key ways for you to communicate what you're doing and why it's important, why you're effective and efficient. And finally, it will help the police to do more with less in a world of declining resources. You not only have to be efficient, you have to realize that the funds that are often being dispensed for policing are declining. So you have to learn how to do your job better with less funds. And often I don't think they're giving you a break and saying, that's okay, we don't care about crime reduction, et cetera. We expect you to do it, just be efficient. But it's also an advanced police science. It'll allow better access of researchers to agencies and data. That'll help us develop the basic research. We'll increase financial support for research and policing. You know, in the US, in Congress, the way you get funding is that you go to the congressman and you push for the importance of a specific problem. Police in the US in general, they go to Congress, they ask for guns. They ask for GPS. They almost never ask, although that's changing today, beginning to change. In the past, at least, they never asked, we need more science. We need to know how to use DNA effectively. We need to know how to use AVL effectively. But that's what happens. If the police own science, that will happen. And then there'll be a greater funding and a greater knowledge base for police to build upon. Finally, it will increase the prestige and status of police science. And this, for me, is really from the science perspective, is really important. A lot of people say to me, David, what you are suggesting is that we trivialize what we're doing. We should be studying just these broad issues, etc. What is this? We should be developing the problems. The police shouldn't tell us how to develop them. I don't think it's helped the prestige of medical science. The medical science is devoted to the everyday reality of doctors in the field, the practitioners, and what they do and how they can do it. I think it's add prestige and status. Indeed, I would say to my colleagues in academia, I'd say, if you take this direction, you're only going to increase the status and prestige of police science, which I think needs to be done as well. So, police ownership of science is critical for advancing both policing and police science. And I hope my words today have convinced you of that at least a bit. Thank you.